In support of this week's dive into Louisiana and its food that slowly, in fits and starts, would invade self-consciously plain America, I figured an acknowledgement of what was going on in Louisiana before colonization would be worthwhile. That takes us to the World Heritage Site Poverty Point National Monument in Epes, Louisiana, up in the northeast corner of the state. Mostly maintained and operated by the state of Louisiana as a reservoir, bird migration stopover, and space for aquatic recreation, boating and fishing and such, it is also the location of a major nexus in the trading network that used to range over the coastal areas of North America before any colonization occurred. A mound built of about 2 million cubic meters or yards of dirt was built on this site. This human-moved, basket-carried dirt was formed into a mound of 6 concentric Cs, or half-circles. The diameter is about 3/4 of a mile, or 1.2 kilometers. Currently, the ridges rise 4 to 6 feet, or 1 to 2 meters above the surrounding plain, but may have originally been twice that high. This structure currently sits about 15 miles or 25 kilometers away from the Mississippi, but the wandering habit of the river makes it very possible this mound structure was along the river, or at least far closer, when it was fully inhabited about 3,000 years ago. Artifacts on the mound and the surrounding area show that the stones used in tools and decorative or ceremonial items seem to have come from as far away as 800 miles or 1,300 kilometers away. Most of the animal bones were from fish, alligators, deer, and fowl. Plant debris point to the mound builders having a complex hunter-gatherer society that cultivated plant foods where they grew, rather than preparing fields and growing crops close to their villages. Their art and arrowhead styles tie them to other hunter-gatherer traditions rather than the more farming and corn-centric societies that existed at the same time. Despite the clearly rich variety of food, art, and construction that exists at Poverty Point, or Point de Pauvreté as it would have been known at its time of discovery, because the name was conferred upon it by someone prospecting for lead ore around the meandering Bayou Mekong in 1843. A plantation nearby lent its name to the site. So since then, it's been a local curiosity, with multiple excavations taking place there about every 20 years or so following the end of the Civil War. It was dedicated a National Historic Landmark in 1962, and excavations became more frequent, more organized, and better documented around 1988 when it was finally designated a national monument under the aegis of the National Park Service. The cataloging of artifacts and the recognition that it was the largest mound site in North America both contributed to it being designated a World Heritage Site in 2014. While the Egyptian and Mayan pyramids get all the press, the mounds dotting the North American continent that I am starting to more or less crash into as I creep across the surface of our culinary history make me feel rather short-changed. I'll say it again. There are massive North American earthworks just absolutely all over the place, and nobody told me. What gives? As a place to visit, it's a window into the agricultural richness of the Mississippi Valley. This part of the Southeast is one of the most fully packed with good growing things, both of the conventional farm type and the wild game still thick on the ground and in the local waters. Farms are on rich river loess, and the swamps and forests are full of a dizzying variety of edible things. If you're looking at it the right way, you can see why it was popular with people looking at the world through a lens of how do I get enough food, both before and after colonization. So for a look at America's way past, go check out the Poverty Point National Monument in Epes, Louisiana. Episode 101, How Louisiana Became America and the Food Riches We Snagged in the Purchase. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, it's a History Look Back episode I'll be briefly talking some French history and describing how President Thomas Jefferson was offered the Louisiana Purchase, and I'll start explaining what that was about to mean for the American menu. When I started composing this episode, I thought it would be a jaunt into the history of gumbo, but as with my old school history of episodes, it's going to take 2 parts to get to gumbo: history and food background first. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that while Napoleon was inarguably a great battlefield tactician, he was a vain, self-important human who was always going to be terrible at governing a large empire. While he often regretted the sale of the Louisiana territory, which he mostly totally didn't really have the power to sell, there are numerous threads of history to prove he would have lost control of it if he'd tried to hold on to it. He simply never had the temperament to govern, but I bet there are some fun alt histories out there. That said, the machinations that went into the sale and the questionably legal purchase by the U.S. president are theatrical and ridiculous enough for me to be unable to resist retelling some of them here. So turn off the new season of Survivor and Bachelor and we'll do political intrigue for the real high stakes. 1789. It's one of several important revolutionary years in France, but it's the one most Americans can remember. I'm going to pick and choose the events to string together for the story I care about, and if you want a more complete accounting, I will direct you once again over to Mike Duncan's Revolutions podcast. Seasons 3, 5, 6, and 7, and, throw in season 4 because the whole Saint-Domingue Haiti story is really part of the whole thing as well. Anyway, 1789, the French Revolution that we think of when Americans say French Revolution really gets underway. At this point, America has happened, but it's still figuring out how to run itself. The successful declaration of the independence of America was also weirdly among the causes of the French Revolution, and not that it inspired it exactly. See, King Louis XVI gave all that money to Lafayette and some other guys to help the Americans, not because he loved the idea of democratic governance. It's really that he just super hated the English. He really just wanted those kooky Continentals to stick it to George III and make him look silly and cut off that supply of American white pines and the big oak trees that were allowing the British to build the biggest boats with the tallest masts and make a mockery of the French Navy. Incidentally, France would take advantage of this and buy fast boats from the new America post-revolution, or revolutions, because America was building the very fastest boats there for a while. I'll get back to that when I talk 19th century China trade, human trafficking, and whaling. But anyway, a decent part of the reason had the firepower to kick out the British was because the French were willing to use us for a proxy war, and that was expensive. And it wasn't just Marie Antoinette's taste for big hair and fancy playhouses or Louis XVI's habit of dropping humongous necklaces on his mistresses that had the Ancien Regime awash in a sea of red ink. Funding a proxy war to make the British look foolish also had a hand in it. Anyway, back in France, people are mad. There's a lot of starving, terrible PR, a whole mess with finances and the military, and next thing you know, France has no king. Having had a monarchy of some sort or other for over 1,000 years, the country was a bit at sea and did very poorly with a variety of attempts at alternate forms of government. Pretty soon, most people don't care who's in charge as long as they stop throwing wars so everyone can go back to growing food and most of the people can quit having famines. Thank you very much. Now, this takes several attempts, many disastrous from the point of view of a family on a small farm that has to pay the salt tax in order to preserve enough pork to make it through February and March when nothing is growing yet. But things finally calmed down, partly due to Napoleon taking the fighting outside of the country. At last, wheat could be harvested, chickens could be brought up, butter churned, eggs sold, and so on. Money was also coming in from the looting of other parts of Europe, but the stuff the average farmer cared about was butter, lower salt taxes, and the fact that their goods were finally selling for good prices. In 1799, after a bunch of military adventurism all the way out to Turkey and Egypt, Napoleon returned with cool presents, a poor battle record, but a whole lotta clout. He closes down the squabbling, disorganized, infighting legislative body that's currently doing a bad job of ruling the country, and names himself the first consul Napoleon for 10 years. Now, at this point, North America was roughly divided into thirds by 3 European-facing powers. The British-facing Americans had effectively put their stamp on everything north of La Florida and west to the Mississippi, the old barrier of the Appalachians having been thoroughly ignored by now. France had claimed everything between the Mississippi and the string of mountains known as the Continental Divide and loosely defined as the Rocky Mountains, though today you look on a map and it's a string of a bunch of different named ranges. On the other side of these mountains, Spain claimed everything from the water to the east where stuff got steep. The fact that there were hundreds of independent, interconnected, and squabbling nations already present on all this land was apparently not relevant to the European Atlantic Ocean-facing political games these 3 states were engaged in with each other. So France had been in charge of the vaguely defined Louisiana territory from 1682 until 1762, when it was transferred to Spanish hands and became part of New Spain starting kind of 1764-ish. Now, this all happened as part of a secret treaty tied up in the 7 Years' War, which was part of the whole Britain, Spain, France 3-way proxy war in North America that raged on for decades. And just for the record, the Spanish also sold arms to the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War because at that point they hated the British as well and so used New Orleans as a way to ship in Spanish arms. And Spanish possession of New Orleans is why all those French-looking houses in the city have those Spanish-looking ironwork railings. It's part of what gives the city its unique look. And it also contributed to the invention of jambalaya, which shares its roots with Valencian paella, and I promise I'll explain more about that later. Anyway, in 1801, France and Spain were on the same side of hating Britain, and in exchange for parts of Italy, which France gave to Spain, France took this Louisiana part of the unruly Americas off Spain's hands for just reasons. I don't know. Bribes, marriages, bags of gold bars, whatever. With New Orleans back in French hands, Napoleon, among other wildly impractical ideas, decided to retake Haiti. However, distance, terrain, and yellow fever made this a ridiculous venture, along with the fact that the French soldiers had the wrong disease exposures and wool uniforms unsuited to the Caribbean climate. They were also largely conscripts, and the Haitians were absolutely unwilling to lose the freedom they had gained at so much personal cost. And so despite a few tactical successes, the Get Haiti Back venture was a failure. By 1803, the monetary and human costs were just too high, so Napoleon called it quits. Mired in debt and deciding that without the coffee, sugar, and basically money factory of Saint-Domingue, the port of Nouveau Orleans and the watershed of the Mississippi River that France had been claiming as theirs wasn't worth holding on to. And if Napoleon was going to invade Britain and give them the drubbing that they so clearly deserved, he needed cash. So, New Orleans and the Louisiana Territory were offered to baby America. The Jefferson administration was planning on offering $10 million in $1,800 for basically the port of New Orleans and surrounds, but France offered them the whole Louisiana territory for $15 million. So the guys carrying out the mission, future President James Monroe and this other guy Livingston, they went ahead and did the ask for forgiveness rather than permission thing. It would have taken 4 months at the minimum to back and forth this whole thing, and they were afraid the French would withdraw the offer. And that $15 million, it was about $350 million in 2020-ish money, by the way. And it strikes me that this offering up of the Louisiana Territory was one of the first times the idea of eating the whole cake, possessing the entire width of the continent of North America, was considered by this audacious toddler nation. Soon-to-be President Monroe came home with a huge chunk of territory and maybe even early visions of the Monroe Doctrine. I mean, dream big, man. Monroe arrived home with the announcement, "Look what I bought." Many members of Congress, particularly in the House of Representatives, were not happy about this and tried to repudiate the purchase. The idea that the eastern seaboard might possibly lose clout to the future new citizens of this future new territory drove them mad, as did the apparently reckless burdening of the public purse. Then, as now, there were plenty of people who were not cool with America being in debt. Anyway, papers sailed back and forth across the ocean, and there was a day in 1804 when there was the official public transfer of Louisiana from Spain to France to America. Incidentally, this is still celebrated as Three Flags Day in the state. Phew! Anyway, as you can see, from the layering of the earliest villages of native populations, the French, some Germans, the Spanish, a large variety of enslaved and then freed Africans from up and down the West Coast, plus surely a few Malagasy from the Madagascar slave trade, along with English, Filipinos as a consequence of the Spanish and Portuguese traffic with those islands as part of their whole Chinese trading adventures, along with any number of pirates from everywhere in the world, China, Malay, coastal Indian cities, Arab ports of call. By 1804, with 150 years of global interactions, the number of food traditions making their mark on the area were beyond count, but extremely tasty. What's really important for our story is that it was all just too much for the American palate, especially from the place of almost proud simplicity America inhabited culinarily. The arrival of Louisiana bombarded America with foreign flavors, chili peppers, French pretensions, the Spanish love of garlic, rice all over the place, and the African habit of savory tidbits deep fried in oil. And if that wasn't all too much, there was also the dark, complex, layered spice cooking traditions that had seeped out from the lands that looked towards the Spice Islands, and had done so long before the 15th century European spice madness got rolling. In America, flavoring meant salt and sugar and some nutmeg. So the mystery and power of the spice blend that was firmly part of Louisiana cooking was really just too much for America. For more details, check back in with episode 38 for more on spice history. All in all, this foreign country being absorbed, fully formed into insecure, scattered America, would not touch most of the early American kitchens. And so Louisiana cuisine remained mostly separate for a long time. But a few things did creep in to the general American kitchen consciousness. As I mentioned in the introduction to this episode, the Mississippi Valley leading down to the port was almost unimaginably fertile. The Virginia soil that had been sucked dry 100 years earlier for tobacco was similar, but was somewhat in the past. The new Kentucky fields were also as rich, but they could get snow and have late springs. But the Mississippi Valley was something altogether amazing, even with all the bugs and snakes. The European immigrants and the Africans stolen to work the land were amazed at the richness of the soil formed by that huge riverbed of the Mississippi. Everything, it seemed, native and imported, that needed rich soil, plenty of water, and heat grew in profusion. Cash crops like rice, sugar, indigo, tobacco, along with food crops, wheat, fruits, vegetables, corn, millet, sorghum, strawberries, tomatoes, and sweet potatoes. The rivers also made for excellent transport, and the established port city of New Orleans created another outlet for the growing exportables of America to the wider world. And the southern location meant ships could more easily get to places that were a little bit hard to navigate to from places like, say, Boston, New York, and Newport. And the trading relationships that the merchants had built up over decades in this new port created new lines for trade that had been closed to or simply invisible to the very Anglophone-focused early America. Not to mention all those trees. The forests of Louisiana provided shipping with a rich source of timber to build even more boats, though mainly for the upriver trading, and barrels. Many, many more barrels for moving dry goods and liquids all about the new land. The trees for building them were right there, right by the river. Compared to most American villages, towns, and cities, which were new, rough, and uncultured, New Orleans was well established and definitely had culture at this point. It had a cathedral, theaters, cobbled streets, eating clubs, street vendors, art, comforts from Paris and Madrid, linen, silver, carved tables, chairs, and chests of exotic woods, fantastical Spanish ironwork, carriages, carpets, spices, and gardens of age with statues and fountains. So as a daring and dangerous city, but one with access to the wonders of the world, some of its food was seeping into the regular, well-established American diet, even if mainly in the pages of gracious printed cookbooks of the upper class or through the past words of working sailors. Now, there had always been a little bit of exchange between the older exotic outposts of the plantations in the Caribbean with the newer American plantations through family and business connections. I mean, consider the whole "which Charles Pinckney are you talking about" nonsense of last week. And this had been intensified by flight from France with the chaos of the revolutions there, and reached its height with immigration from Saint-Domingue after the Haitian Revolution in 1790. Those refugees, the big whites, the little whites, the Creoles, the Criollo, the free-colored, and the still enslaved all came with food and farming traditions of their own when they resettled. Some around Savannah and Richmond, but mainly in Charleston, South Carolina, and the New Orleans, Louisiana surrounds. The first glimpse of a widely recognized new American food smashing together African, Caribbean, and American foods had been the pepper pot stews that were popular as a colonial and early American street food. And its defining ingredients were largely beef offals, British and American, black pepper, cubebs or long pepper, largely African and fancy European, and hot chili peppers, Caribbean. But other foods of this polyglot lineage started to appear in this area anywhere. Freed Africans and their descendants were establishing food vending establishments. While New America ate abundant meals, many visitors found them crude, lacking in flavor, lacking in variety, and conversation. But there was a lot of food. In fact, many were shocked at the habit of Americans using meal times mainly for, the consumption of food. It was just all out of sorts to them. And there was little restaurant culture at this age. Basically just taverns, or one ate at the house where one knew people, or at homes that took in diners for pay. And there was almost no snacking culture. Meal times, partly due to the stew and porridge center of American food, almost had to be eaten at a table of some sort, or at least around a pot, even if it was BYO spoon and bowl, which it often was. By the time we get to this age, the turn of the 19th century, the country was on the move in ways that were new to the country and somewhat new to the European world. And so taverns were definitely on the rise, as were street foods in the cities. But this was mainly occurring in port towns, which meant West Africans and some Malagasy Africans, both freed and under a variety of arrangements with the people who owned them, they were starting to become prevalent in selling street foods. By the by, this pattern will get repeated on the West Coast in a few seasons, but there the major street vendors will be Chinese and of complicated Spanish and indigenous extraction, but that's later. So along with the oysters and the pepper pot and a few other things like callas, which are basically arancini, that is fried balls of leftover seasoned rice, fried savories on sticks, and versions of fried meat pies, the Caribbean patties are descendant of these tasties and a cousin to the empanada, a wider variety of street food really starts to appear in America. And then the richness of the farmland and the variety of growing things meant fruit vendors would also start to appear in season. And then these would soon expand into all manner of seasonal delivery services and work alongside the future icemen. And many of these structural innovations also flowed out of Louisiana, specifically New Orleans. Now, the first fingers of specifically this New Orleans, Louisiana food that noticeably creep into mainstream American kitchens were tomatoes, showing up in things like red rice, as well as being treated just like another vegetable. Okra would occasionally pop above the surface, but not noticeably because it's a warmer weather crop that was not compatible with the climate of most of the country at that time. When I started talking about flour showing up as a thickener a couple of episodes ago, in sauces and gravies and puddings, replacing egg yolks, this early version of roux in America also owes a little bit to the influences of this new city with its Frenchified culinary traditions. And the knowledge of how to cook rice, while yes, it did spread due to the upheaval of wars, was common knowledge within the Creole population of La Louisiane that suddenly found themselves in New Orleans, Louisiana. How disorienting. That decades-long soap opera that got us from the colonial French port city to American Louisiana took up more space than I had planned when I started, so it'll be next week when I finally get to historical gumbo. It'll get us up to what gumbo probably looked like in 1804 at the 3 Flags Day celebrations and in the decades to come. And I'll also do something about explaining the roots of jambalaya and possibly a few other things that we think of as true New Orleans foods today. I'll see what the research reveals. Thanks for listening. Any email questions or quibbles will continue to reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. Downloading the episodes helps me know you are out there, but even better than that are your reviews. Let more people know you're listening and enjoying the show, or at least find it interesting. Want more food and history in your future? You can catch me and a whole gaggle of history podcasters on Saturday, November 4th at the Intelligent Speech Online Conference. Tickets are now available, and I even have a discount code. It's FOOD. See me live a few times, and you can even ask me questions. I'm also doing a deep dive into the 19th century with a co-host, Jamie Lewis of Plague of Strength, and our much looser and rather wilder podcast, Prize Fighters, Circus Freaks, and Gangsters. There's still food, but now with fashion, fighting, and fraud, or straight up crime. Lots and lots of crime. After last week's elephant and shiny clothing spiked adventure, we review a much earlier attempt to trace the adventures of a Chinese immigrant in the 19th century American West. And let's just say it's not pretty, and we have a lot of fun, and maybe lose our cool a little bit over the zippers and the bad mustaches. But anyway, it's a hoot. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and you can find me on Threads and Insta as @THoAFood. But these days, I'm all X'd out. All of this information is available in the show description.